Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 21st of July. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by two Kirstys in the studio. We have Blackman, the SNP MP for Aberdeen North, and Kirsty's also the SNP's newly elected whip at Westminster. And congratulations, Kirsty, on your successful re-election as an MP, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's awesome to be here.
Thank you. And also we have Kirsty Hughes. Kirsty, you're a writer and commentator on Scottish politics, and you're an expert on Scottish politics, and you have a Substack blog, which, forgive me, I can't read my own handwriting there. It's Europe, Scotland and Europe.
Europe and Scotland.
Europe and Scotland. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
It's great to be here. There's so much to talk about.
It's true. So, speaking of which, today is Ukraine update 8. Today is day 879 of the war in Ukraine. And our update starts with Russia launched its fifth drone attack on Kyiv in 2 weeks, but air defence systems destroyed all of them before they reached the capital, Ukraine's military said on Sunday. There were no casualties and no significant damage reported, the head of the capital's military administration has said. Terry Popko said the systematic attacks with the drones showed Russia was testing new tactics, looking for new approach routes to the capital, trying to expose the location of their air defence. Ukraine's air defence systems destroyed 35 of the 39 drones and 2 cruise missiles that Russia had launched overnight, Ukraine's Air Force said on Telegram. Weapons targeted 10 of the Ukraine's regions. A Russian missile damaged critical infrastructure in the Shostnitsky district of Sumy, the region's military administration has said. And Russian missiles and artillery fire in northeast and southern Ukraine killed at least 3 people on Saturday, law enforcement agencies said. The missile attack was launched around 3:15 a.m. on the town of Barnikov in the Izium district, and the northeast of Kharkiv region's prosecutor's office said. Statement listed the dead as 2 men aged 48 and 69 and said about 50 buildings were damaged in the strike, apparently by 3 Russian Iskander missiles. Another strike hit an agricultural business in the village of Oleskiva, it said, with no reported casualties. Separate artillery shelling later on Saturday killed a 44-year-old man in the city of Nikopol in Ukraine's south. Russia's air defence system destroyed 8 drones that Ukraine launched overnight, the Russian Defence Ministry said. And the death toll from a Russian strike on a playground in Mykolaiv on Friday rose to 4, including 1 child, with 24 injured, the mayor of the southern city said on Telegram. Chechen soldiers, known for their antics on TikTok, are being put on the Ukraine war's front line in a sign of the Russian military's desperation, the UK Ministry of Defence said. In a video posted to X, it said pro-Russian Chechen forces had been fighting in Ukraine since 2014. But after initial heavy losses had become largely relegated to conducting rear area security operations. However, since the withdrawal of Wagner forces from the war, these TikTok soldiers are being pressed back into the frontline service, the MOD said. Donald Trump says he will prevent World War III from happening and that he will have the war between Russia and Ukraine settled if he is re-elected in November. Trump's comments came a day after he said he had a call with Volodymyr Zelensky and told the Ukrainian president he would end the war. Trump has repeatedly claimed he would end the war quickly without giving details as to how. Zelensky said he had agreed to arrange a meeting with Trump. Kirsty, up in Aberdeen, is there anything in today's Ukraine update that you'd like to highlight?
I think it's really important to remember that this is happening. Sometimes that, kind of is ignored in the news, and actually, for and I tend to think of things from the point of view of the people involved rather than the kind of big politics that are involved. The Russian strike on the playground is just completely horrific. And I think that actually thinking about the lives of people in Ukraine just now and how they're under threat every day, it is really important that we continue to step up, that we try to ensure that we're doing what we can to protect Ukraine, both from a Westminster point of view, but also from the support that we're giving those people that have moved to Scotland as a result of fleeing from Ukraine. I think it's just incredibly important to keep talking about this, to keep being aware of it. War in Europe is incredibly shocking that we are in this situation of a war in Europe, but it is probably good and pretty scary that Russia is now getting a bit more desperate in this regard and has actually faced a significant amount more opposition than they expected to do.
Thank you, Kirsty. And Kirsty, for you, I tend to, when I'm reading these figures out, I try and imagine what it would be like if these things were happening in Scotland, and but is there anything that you'd like to highlight about today's update?
I think it's important, as Kirsty Blackman says, we need to keep talking about and reporting on and knowing what's going on in Ukraine. I think in terms of the last week, looking at it from a European perspective, in Brussels, we've seen Ursula von der Leyen has been re-elected as the president of the European Commission for the next 5 years. We've got more far-right MPs in the European Parliament, which is, of course, disturbing in many ways, but actually the far-right MEPs, members of the European Parliament, are divided amongst themselves on Ukraine. So although there's plenty we could talk about that's unstable across Europe at the moment in terms of European politics, I think we're in a relatively good place in terms of European support for Ukraine and for President Zelensky. And so the biggest political worry is not only the possibility or even probability of a Trump presidency, but with all the pressure on Joe Biden to resign, which he's still resisting, you do have to worry about what's happening to the focus on other key issues, both Ukraine, Gaza, and other challenges.
Thank you, Kirsty. So I'll move on to today's update in Gaza and Israel. So at least 38,919 Palestinians have been killed and 89,622 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October. The SNP has said the restoration of funding for the United Kingdom, for the United Nations Reliefs and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, must mark the first step in starting to right past wrongs. The call for action comes following yesterday's ruling by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, that Israel should stop settlement activity in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem and end its illegal occupation of those areas and the Gaza Strip as soon as possible. Kirsty, coming to you first on this one. Kirsty, do you think the ICJ's latest judgment will affect Israel's treatment of Palestine?
I think in the short run, sadly but unsurprisingly not, Israel throughout its attack on Gaza and then its increasing attacks on the West Bank and then genocide in Gaza has shown itself fairly immune to international opinion and international law. But I do think it matters because that sort of international legal judgment gives considerable strength and support for all those who've down the years and decades, as well as in recent months, been calling out Israeli apartheid in the West Bank. And it puts pressure on the UK, Germany, and US, the main arms suppliers to the Israeli government, to pay attention to those international judgments. And we're still learning what Keir Starmer is going to be like as a prime minister across a lot of different areas. But of course, he was a human rights lawyer. He does, it would seem so far, put a lot of emphasis on the rule of law, including international law. But of course, we've also seen David Lammy this week say that he's not in a position yet to say whether he'll suspend arms sales to Israel, but that he wouldn't expect to suspend all arms sales to Israel, but because it has to be able to defend itself in its region. So that looks to me already like a compromise too far. But before we only criticise this new Labour government, the as you report, the starting of funding again for UNRWA is extremely important. Obviously, Israel is still making it extremely hard to get needed and urgent supplies into Gaza. So the situation is beyond words. It's beyond appalling. But from the UK government, that is one welcome step.
Thank you, Kirsty. And you share a workplace with the new Defence Minister, Mr. Lammy, and thinking about, should the UK be supplying arms to Israel? Have you spoken to him about it, or have you been in the chamber when he has spoken about it?
So I haven't spoken to him about it, but Brendan O'Hara wrote to him about it, saying we should cease selling the arms. I actually raised it in Parliament back when it was the Tory government, and raised the fact that basically they do a review of a country's actions as to whether or not the licenses should be granted to sell them arms. And they looked at the review, but they looked at a review from earlier last year, and looked at Israel's actions from earlier last year, and then made a decision to carry on selling arms. So I think there's some process issues that need to be sorted out. But it is the case, as Kirsty Hughes says there, that countries like the UK, Germany, and US are, it seems, almost scared to take action. They're kind of they've boxed themselves into this position where they can't do anything but support Israel, despite the fact that it becomes more evident every day that Israel is breaking international laws, and the action that it's taking, that it is um, committing war crimes when it comes to this. So I think that it's helpful to have the kind of international move towards saying Israel is doing something illegal here, and therefore action needs to be taken against them, or at least sort of sanctions needs to be taken when it comes to particularly arms sales. And just on a kind of human level, Gaza's got the highest number of child amputees of anywhere in the world. Now, that is utterly horrific, and Israel cannot justify their position when you look at numbers like that, when you look at the human misery and death that is being caused by Israel's actions in Gaza. And also when you look at, it's not just about the actions in relation to the deaths of civilians, it's about the actions in relation to the stopping of aid, for example. I mean, that's just unforgivable and needs to be stopped immediately.
Thank you, Kirsty. The next item is the King's speech. Panto season came early this week. The stark contrast of the pomp and ceremony of the state opening of the UK Parliament against the new Labour government's refusal to abolish the two-child cap could not have been made clearer as poverty campaigners demand that the policy is abolished. Kirsty, I'm really keen to hear from you first, as an MP based in Westminster. And when I was looking into this item, I couldn't help thinking about when the SNP's Opposition Day motion to an immediate ceasefire in Gaza was stolen by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party because he feared an all-out rebellion from his MPs. Now, of course, everything's completely different since the general election now for you and for your colleagues. And I noted that you gave your allegiance in Doric, which was great to hear. Thank you for doing that. But can you give us an idea just how it feels down there now? Is it, and how it's maybe different, or what's the same?
So on the Doric thing, that's actually the third time I've done my oath in Doric, or swearing in Doric. It's the affirmation I do rather than the religious oath. But Doric is my first language, and I spoke Doric before I spoke English, so it makes sense to me to try and do it in Doric. And actually, just one more thing on Doric. It's really heartening to hear so many kids nowadays locally actually speaking in Doric, and you'll be standing at a bus stop and the bairns will be shouting at each other in Doric or having a good yap in Doric. And so I'm really pleased to see the kind of increase in the use of the language again. I think schools are being a lot more flexible and better in their dealing with local dialects. So that's really positive. Thinking about and looking at Parliament now, in the kind of different situation that we find ourselves in as well. So obviously we've gone from having nearly 50 MPs to having 9 MPs. So from the SNP's point of view, there's a massive readjustment that we've got to do. We've only got one MP in our group that has previously been in the kind of fourth party. You know, most of us were elected post 2015 when we had the massive 56 MPs and that huge swing towards us. So that's a very different situation for how we interact with Parliament, for how many questions we get in the chamber, for example, for the possibility of us being able to push votes. And we're still kind of trying to work out exactly what that means and what that looks like and how best to work together as a group. Particularly, we've got two new members, sorry, as well. So they've got to work out how to slot themselves in. So that's it from kind of our point of view, but actually from a wider Parliament bubble point of view, um, it's really unusual having a government with such a huge majority. So whether it's a Tory government or a Labour government, this size of majority is, pretty much unheard of. It's massive. So even if we are in a situation where, say, on the two-child cap or on Gaza with arms sales to Israel, a significant number of the Labour backbenchers are willing to see sense and support the morally correct position on this, then you've still got a massive Labour majority. So it's interesting to see actually how can we use this to our advantage? Can we use it to our advantage with this big a Labour majority? And we're still trying to figure all of this stuff out. Certainly on two-child cap, which is the amendment that we put down. There's also an amendment on arms sales to Israel. It's been put down by one of the Labour MPs. Certainly on both of those things, there are Labour backbenchers who will be willing to break with the whip and who will be willing to vote with us. Whether that's enough to give Keir Starmer a scare, whether that's enough to ensure that he is moving towards the correct position on things remains to be seen. But we'll keep doing what we can and using every kind of in and every opportunity and working with all the other parties on a case by case basis to try and get the right result, to try and get enough support, at least to have the issue heard properly in Parliament, and hopefully have enough pressure put on the Prime Minister to make a move towards what we know is the right thing.
Thank you, Kirsty. And can I stay with you for a second, if that's okay? I'm just interested to find out what your thoughts were. I'm guessing you were in the chamber when Stephen Flynn had his speech earlier this week, his first since Parliament opened, and he brought up the two-child cap.
Do you know what? I actually wasn't in the chamber when Stephen gave his speech. So because it's the school holidays, I've had some childcare related issues. So I've had my bairns in Parliament for a couple of weeks, and who have been immensely good, by the way, and very well behaved. But I wasn't in the chamber. But I watched it back. I also watched back our two maiden speeches, which were done on Wednesday. So Seamus Logan and Graham Ledbetter both did their maiden speeches, and they're absolutely worth watching, by the way, if you get a chance to look on Parliament Live to watch those back. They're really, really good to see those. So have a look at those. But I think Stephen's focus on the two-child cap was incredibly important. We know how many people, we know how many families, we know how many children are put into poverty as a result of this. Scottish Government does what it can, and actually Scottish Government has kept so many children out of poverty with our mitigation measures. But given how much austerity there has been, given 14 years of Tory austerity, actually there's only so much we can do with our balanced budget, with the kind of mitigations that we can put in place. And we know that if they scrap the two-child cap right now, 300,000 children would be lifted out of poverty, and a further 700,000 would be in less deep poverty than they currently are. So it was good to, as I say, hear back Stephen speaking. It was good to hear he's certainly not lost any of his flair in the chamber, and it was also good to see that some of the mainstream media were reporting the fact that he intervened on Keir Starmer as well and asked him specifically about this matter. And we need to keep that pressure up on the Prime Minister. I don't know how anybody can justify keeping kids in poverty.
Thank you, Kirsty. And over to you. I think Stephen Flynn said that by keeping the two-child cap, it keeps children in poverty and it impacts 27,000 households in Scotland, just to complement the figures you gave there, Kirsty. So the two-child cap is still in place. So does that mean that child poverty is not a priority for Starmer?
I think that Firstly, I think I was very impressed, I have to say, by Stephen Flynn getting this on the agenda, getting the amendment in. You know, the SNP has, as Kirsty said, you know, it's gone down from 47 to 9 MPs. The political situation has changed in Scotland. It's changed across the UK. And so to bring this to the top of the political and media agenda, I think is really important. And yes, Labour has this huge majority, but it's like you try and influence international affairs too, trying to have debate, publicity, public awareness, and so forth is extremely important. What worries me about it is a couple of things. I think we've already seen some journalists suggesting that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves very much won't want to give in to this pressure because they see it as a test of their fiscal discipline, which of course is their own fiscal discipline they've imposed over tightly on themselves. You know, they've tied their own hands. And I do wonder if hiding behind that a bit is political calculations around previous English Conservative voters that Labour were very much targeting, who approve of constraints and cuts in benefits. And it takes me back. I remember the Tony Blair victory in 1997, and what was actually done in the first 1 or 2 weeks was that Tony Blair and New Labour, so-called, cut and took away the single parent benefit supplement. That was to prove that they were no longer doing tax and spend, and it was an attack on the poorest. So it was an active step they took there. And what we see now is a refusal to undo a really vicious Conservative policy that is both creating poverty, extra poverty, as we've discussed, but it betrays this kind of Victorian attitude to people living in poverty, that one has to control the number of children they have, the feckless poor. So I'm not sure where we're going to see Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves go on this. I mean, throughout the campaign, when Starmer was saying we're not going to change things we can't afford, well, they're in government. This policy costs something like, I was looking it up, but something around 1,000th of government spending. That doesn't mean it's a small amount, but you know, there is a lot of possibility there to see what are your priorities. Keir Starmer has now rather rapidly set up a child poverty working group rather than actually commit to ending the two-child benefit cap. Again, I think the SNP reacted fast then in calling for a Four Nations consideration of ways to tackle child poverty, because we've still got something like 24% level of child poverty in Scotland. So are we going, I mean, my question out of this, it looks terrible for Labour at the moment, but my question for the next couple of months, are we going to see Rachel Reeves' first budget? Are we going to see them find the money to end this? Even if they're not ending it today, will they end it in 3 months' time? Or will they not? And that's perhaps the litmus test.
Thank you. And Kirsty, I wonder, would you maybe want to answer Kirsty's question?
So around the kind of views of those former Tory voters, the folk that have moved over to Labour or lent them their vote for this election because they're fed up with the Tories, it depends how you put it, right? Actually, if you poll people and ask them whether everybody should have enough to live on, whether everybody should be able to afford the basic essentials, people overwhelmingly say yes. And you know, you're talking about Tory voters supporting that, as well as Labour voters supporting it, as well as SNP voters supporting it. So actually, when you explain the benefit system to people, when you explain how social security actually works, and you say that a significant number of folk who are getting universal credit to supplement their income, for example. So I think it's 59% of those, certainly over 50% of those who are impacted by the two-child cap are in work. You know, when you look at those figures and when you speak to people, and when you put it that way, that everybody should be able to afford the basic essentials, they should be able to afford their heating, they should be able to afford food for their kids and clothes for their kids and all of those very basic things, then the public support it. So I think Labour need to rethink, and Kirsty Hughes is absolutely correct there. These are self-imposed fiscal rules. They've chosen to impose these fiscal rules. And actually, looking back at the election campaign and looking back at the amount of votes that Labour got, or the amount of seats certainly that Labour got rather than the amount of votes, they didn't need to. They didn't need to put down these incredibly strict fiscal rules. They could have done what we did in our manifesto, which was saying that if you're spending, if you're doing public sector spend on things like infrastructure, if you're doing public spend on stuff that improves people's lives, then that is worth doing, and you can have flexibility in your fiscal rules around that. And I think looking at some of the stuff that we have in Scotland around well-being, around supporting the population to be happier. I was speaking to a group of small businesses relatively recently, and obviously small business owners have got some issues, some of them, with the idea of increasing the minimum wage, because they're looking at their bottom line and they're thinking, well, if I've got to pay everybody a bit more, then that's going to impact on my profit. But then when you think about the fact that if folk have got enough to live on, they're not spending their working time worrying about whether or not they're going to have enough money to put on their meter. They're not spending their working time worrying about, the fact that their bairn has just gone up 3 shoe sizes in 6 months and that they'll need to buy new shoes. They're spending their working time thinking about work. So you get a massive increase in productivity if everybody has got enough to live on. And it's really rubbish that we've got to make that argument. We should just it should just be self-evident that everybody should be able to afford to live. But when we do make that argument to people, they sort of think, "Oh, you're right. Actually, I get a commensurate increase in productivity if people are happier and if people have got that basic access to all the necessities." So one of the other things, as well as the Four Nations Summit that Stephen Flynn has asked for, is about asking the UK government to scrap the benefit cap and to match the Scottish Child Payment. We know from external sources, we know from everybody that has researched this, that the Scottish Child Payment has had a massive, massive impact in reducing the amount of poverty that there is, particularly among children. And I think that the fact that John Swinney, as soon as he stood up as leader, was very clear that eradicating child poverty is a founding mission, that reducing child poverty is, absolutely up there with the main key things that we're doing in government. I don't know how anyone can argue with that, particularly a Labour government that is apparently left wing.
Thank you, Kirsty. And as you say, if you give cold hard cash to families that are struggling, they will spend that money, and so it goes into the economy. And as you said, it's productivity. Um, Kirsty, I'm actually going to give you a choice, so that we don't just concentrate entirely on the two-child cap and the King's speech. There was more in there than that, but also there was a lot that wasn't in there. But would you rather talk about GB Energy, which was included in the speech, or the renationalisation of railways? Got a preference?
Well, I mean, I think GB Energy is really interesting. I think it's potentially really important. I know the SNP have made a lot of criticisms of it, and I've myself, as many other people, been extremely critical when Keir Starmer did one of his flip-flop U-turns in the years run up to the election and cut the green spending from his really ambitious and hopeful 28 billion a year plans to the less than 5 billion a year, half of which is going into GB Energy. So it's a shadow of what it needs to be, but it's still something, and we have to see what it's going to do. Is it at that small scale really going to be able to invest in a significant way in renewable energy with private sector investors, which appears to be its aim? It's not like some nationalized renewable energy company. And I don't include nuclear power in renewable energy, but it seems that Labour does. And so I think this is it's important, but it's too small. I think it's an interesting challenge for the SNP, not just to say what's wrong with it, but actually to say what it should look like, because there's so many issues in here. There's the question of the just transition in the North Sea. There's the question of what you do with the windfall tax. are all the profits from renewable energy about to go from Scotland to England? But even if Scotland was independent, it would want to be selling some of its renewable energy to England. So, the question here is more about money and profits and who gets it and where it goes than, I think we all want more renewable power. So I think, the SNP clearly has, and Kirsty will talk about this, it has attacked the question of scale, but I think it needs to be quite light-footed around what may be good in what GB Energy does and what may be negative and worthy of criticism.
Thank you, Kirsty. We're technically we're out of time on that item, but I'm just wondering, Kirsty in Aberdeen, but if you'd maybe like to respond to Kirsty's comments. Stephen Flynn did bring up GB News in his speech and said basically that it's not got enough. GB Energy, not GB News. I'm sorry. And he said, I think he just implied that it's not. Labour doesn't plan to spend enough money on it. But would you maybe want to respond to Kirsty's comment?
Aye, so Labour's plans around that, it's a 4.7 billion on green stuff, right? Which is equal to the amount the Scottish Government is spending in 24-25. And they think that that's somehow going to be the right amount for the whole UK. I think Kirsty's right. I think there's pros and cons, and I think there's bits around including investment. Some of the problems that we've seen with the Tory government is that because the Tories have been so flip-floppy around particularly renewable energy, and Cameron's cut the green crap and all of that stuff, it's been very difficult for businesses to make decisions to invest, particularly massive multinational companies who are sort of looking at it and saying, well, actually America's doing all this cool stuff, other countries, Netherlands for example, are doing really interesting things, they're a much safer bet for us to invest in. So I think actually just the kind of direction of travel, if the Labour Party are able to keep that up, then you could see more investment coming in, which is a positive thing. We haven't had any confirmation about where GB Energy's headquarters will be. It's said in the King's speech that it would be in Scotland, but it needs to be in the northeast of Scotland, and we will, not just because we're mostly from the northeast of Scotland, but this is where the majority of the talent is, the majority of the skills, and the majority of some of the infrastructure that there is. So I think that's really important. In terms of actually thinking about what we want GB Energy to do, I would like to see it looking at the energy market, looking at the ways in which people connecting to the grid are charged, looking at the grid in terms of those people that are using electricity and gas and standing charges and the massive disparity that there is in those, ensuring that actually grid connections are agreed far quicker, because that's the major thing that's holding up a lot of the renewable projects. And I don't know if this is within or out with the remit of what Keir Starmer thinks that GB Energy is going to do, but looking at some of the transferability, the skills that there are from offshore oil and gas to offshore renewables, because there's been a real kind of butting up against each other in saying, no, we can't do skills passporting, which is just daft, because you want the people that have got those skills that are in there to be able to transfer over to green energy. So the more pressure the government can put on that, the better. But, I think I would slightly disagree with what Kirsty said, in that it's not just about the money, it's not just about who gets the profits, it's about the fact that those profits exist in the first place. And I'm not convinced that GB Energy is enough to get it to the place that we would like to be. I think it's better than the previous government's position, but I don't think that we're going to be able to take full advantage of the renewables bonanza and the renewables kind of I can't think of the word, but the potential, that's it, the renewables potential that we have in Scotland, unless Keir moves a bit further on this.
Thank you, Kirsty. In Aberdeen. The UK government hosted the 4th European Political Community meeting, otherwise known as EPC, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire earlier this week. It brought together around 50 leaders from across Europe to cooperate on important issues. It allows the European countries to progress discussions which affect the continent as a whole. There were 3 main topics on the agenda: migration, energy and connectivity, and defending and securing democracy. Keir Starmer hosted the summit and said he hopes to reset Britain's relationship with Europe. And Kirsty, as this is your field of expertise, if I'm right, this isn't the EU that we're talking about. This is the continent of Europe. Do you think Sir Keir Starmer's going to succeed in resetting his relationship?
I think the Blenheim summit was actually more interesting than I expected. It was certainly lucky timing for Keir Starmer, because if you're prime minister of a big European country that after Brexit is no longer in the EU, being able to meet and greet 44, 45 European leaders all in a day is actually extremely helpful. And I think in that sense, he did that well. There was good mood music. There was a good reaction in some of the European media from some of the summaries I've seen. And yes, the European political community has only been around for a couple of years. Strangely enough, it was Liz Truss. It was President Macron of France's idea, but Liz Truss, in her brief, disastrous premiership, agreed that the UK would join in. But it's not a summit with any power. It doesn't agree new initiatives. It doesn't do anything. But I think it's a lucky thing for the UK, given that it's no longer at the European councils of the 27 EU leaders. And I suppose, I mean, there's a lot more one could say about Labour and Starmer's approach to the EU. But of course, we know he's adopting the Conservatives' red lines. So no rejoining, no joining the customs union or the single market, now going back to free movement. All of those would obviously be helpful for Scotland. And yet, what you see from what Starmer and David Lammy has said is broadly they want to talk to the EU in the future about trade and taking away trade barriers. They want to talk about, as they did at Blenheim, about migration and police cooperation, and they want to talk about wider security issues. Those are the three big pillars that the EU puts most of its work around. And there's obviously the big problem is Labour refusing to countenance the single market or rejoining the European Union. But what struck me after Wednesday was Starmer is restoring trust. He's not Rishi Sunak sitting there with all sorts of xenophobic, anti-EU, anti-European, unreliable, unstable backbenchers behind him. So he's simply coming across to EU leaders as a serious leader who wants to get stuff done, even if it's going to be relatively small, like a veterinary agreement or perhaps something important to help musicians with their mobility, or we've yet to see it, but something on youth mobility. But I think even if Keir Starmer and Labour just take us a little bit closer to Europe and describe, as he does, EU countries as partners and friends, actually that's going to reinforce the discussion some of us are trying to have about why we should rejoin the EU and why we must talk about it. That's not what he wants, but actually I think the policies he's now following are actually, ironically for him, going to make that whole debate easier.
Thank you, Kirsty. And Kirsty, over to you. Did the summit register at all in Westminster? Do you think is Starmer going to bring something from it that's going to make any difference?
I mean, a wee bit. I think things like the veterinary agreement, although they're small, right, they're important. Things like some of the kind of goods movements, particularly when it comes to sort of phytosanitary agreements and stuff, are important. Those things are really for particular companies, for particular ones in Scotland that produce food, for example. Those things are really key. So I think that's a good thing. I suppose I'm slightly concerned, slightly differently to what Kirsty's saying there. If he does do a bit of this stuff, if he does move slightly closer to Europe, I'm slightly concerned that we end up in a situation where reform get very angry and put a huge amount of pressure on some of the Tories, for example, on Parliament in general. Then we have the entire sort of Parliament lurching even further to the right. We see, more people joining Reform, for example. We see the Tories going even further right because they're chasing Reform, and then we see Labour lurching even further right or even further anti-EU because they're trying to lurch towards the Tories and keep that base that they've got. So I'm slightly concerned about some of the impacts it might have on the politics in Westminster. just like the whole thing is just so frustrating and bizarre. One of the things that I said, or the kind of three priorities that I had when I both during the election campaign and also when I stood on the platform and said thank you very much for electing me, was about just transition, was about cost of living crisis, and was about freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is a good thing. Migration is a good thing, and we are so far away from the position where Labour or the Tories, where any of the government or opposition parties will stand up and talk positively about migration. And that's just thoroughly depressing, to be honest. We need to move to a situation where we are celebrating and welcoming those people that choose to come and live in Scotland from other countries. That's where the majority of the Scottish population is. That's where I would like to see Parliament at least move towards, rather than lurching in the opposite direction that I fear is where we may end up.
Thank you, Kirsty. So the Scottish Government convened an emergency crisis meeting earlier this week, after a global IT outage on Friday, with ministers called to the Scottish Government Resilience Room. The IT outage saw Neil Oliver get very annoyed when his flight from Edinburgh to London was cancelled due to the Microsoft software update outage that took the internet down, causing global chaos for businesses like Edinburgh Airport and organisations like the NHS. Oliver linked the chaos to problems that the Republican National Convention were having with their coverage of some speeches had been disrupted. Oliver surmised that the internet chaos was probably caused by an anti-Trump hacker. It turned out to be dodgy Microsoft software update that was routinely or even automatically adopted across the globe. Kirsty, I'm going to come to you first. Do we rely too much on the internet, and if so, what can be done about it?
Hey, I grew up online, right? We had the internet at home when I was about 8. I don't feel like we rely too much on the internet. I actually think that this has kind of exposed a problem. So the issue basically was there's a company called CrowdStrike that make anti-hacking software that makes security protection for a huge number of companies. It's a massive, massive thing that probably nobody has heard of until this week. Now, it was CrowdStrike's update that caused all the problems. And one of the issues with the fix is that it's got to be applied individually on each machine. So it's a massive change. Now, I think for CrowdStrike, I think for everybody that is creating software updates, this is a really good kick, or a really big kick, to tell them that actually they need to ensure that they properly are checking everything before they are putting it out there. But the way modern life is, that we've got so many benefits from the internet, not just in terms of the fact that you can go to the airport with your mobile phone, with your wee code on your mobile phone and scan it, and then you get through and you don't have to bother with talking to anybody at a check-in desk or anything like that. Not just kind of in the ways of making our lives easier, but also socially, right? You can find groups of people that are like-minded and that will talk to you about the experiences that they've had. So I think there's so many benefits that actually we probably need to accept the fact that we're going to have a few issues sometimes, and we can't 100% rely on any transport system to be totally fail safe. You could have mass flight cancellations because of a volcano erupting or because of fog. So I don't think it's the case that we rely on it too much. I do think it's the case that software developers are going to need to be more careful than CrowdStrike was in this instance.
Thank you, Kirsty. And moving over to you, so it was an automatic third-party security update, and some people wondered if Liz Truss had been given a new appointment at Microsoft. Did you maybe did the outage affect you, Kirsty?
It didn't affect me. It very much reminded me of a lecture I heard actually 10 years ago from work I was doing then. I'm not an IT expert, but I was in London at some annual IT awards ceremony, and the guest lecturer was an expert, and he was talking back then about fragility and vulnerability, not only of global systems, but also, any particular crucial bit of our infrastructure. It might be a hospital, it might be a nuclear power station. And at this distance, I can't remember what all his solutions were, but I think he was talking about you need more diversity, more variety, more backup systems, more local systems. So I don't think, as Kirsty Blackman says, the issue is not about expecting people to give up the internet. It's about the way these structures work and whether we've got the right systems there in terms of the potential vulnerabilities. And there was a lot of disruption to travel, to hospitals, to doctors' surgeries, and so on. But relatively speaking, you can imagine, it's not hard to imagine something much, much worse. So I suppose what I would like to hear more of is experts who really understand the different levels and layers of vulnerability in our systems.
Thank you, Kirsty. And to our other Kirsty, one tech. I mean, I didn't grow up with the internet. You can probably tell I'm way older than the internet. But I agree with you. It is incredible. I could not have envisaged it before it materialised. And I've watched it unfold because I was working at the time, and we didn't even know what it was going to be. We heard about it before we saw it or experienced it. But one tech expert said that we have a dangerous digital monoculture, and just like agricultural monocultures, it's very susceptible to blight and disease. I don't know, is there a couple of minutes? Is there anything else to say on this?
I think, actually, when Kirsty was speaking there, that's what I was thinking about. Is the part of the issue is that if you hadn't had quite so many companies using CrowdStrike, and it was almost exclusively companies that were affected, it wasn't individuals because individuals don't use CrowdStrike. If you didn't have that kind of monopoly by this company, then it wouldn't have affected nearly so much. So, I think actually maybe looking at the way that capitalism is structured in this regard, maybe looking at the way that actually we don't have a market, we don't have that wide market there, and we need to have a plethora of different ones so that if something does go down, then it's affecting a smaller percentage of machines rather than what we see now. But I do think the internet, I do think it's overwhelmingly made our lives better. It's made some things more difficult, but overwhelmingly better. But there's not a kind of grand plan, right? It's sort of happened. It sort of happened organically rather than being planned. And maybe now's the time for there to be a bit more of a look at internationally with some of the discussions that we're having with other countries, having a bit of a look at how do we manage this so that those vulnerabilities are reduced, so that the reliance on the technology is less likely to cause problems.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I suppose it's a bit like electricity. You just take it for granted. You walk into a room and you flick a switch and the lights come on. And it's the same with the internet, maybe. So maybe we shouldn't take it so much for granted. So there was July 16th saw the publication of the 2023 Scottish Social Attitude Survey, which measures and tracks changes in people's social, political and moral attitudes in Scotland, and has been doing so since 1999. Amongst other things, it tracks public attitudes to government, the economy and public services. Well, I'm guessing that would include ferries, exclamation mark. Kirsty, I'm going to ask you first. So who do the people of Scotland trust most in the long term to make the best decisions for Scotland? Will it be the Scottish Government or the UK Government, according to this survey, do you think?
Well, I mean, the survey is very interesting. It shows levels of trust compared to 2019 in the Scottish Government falling, but it also shows levels of trust in the Scottish Government much higher than in the UK Government. And just like when one is trying to understand the results of elections in Scotland or the general election we just had, it's very important to try and understand, obviously, what is going on. And if you are comparing levels of trust today or last year to 2019, then of course we've had Brexit taking effect, we've had the COVID pandemic, we've had the Russia invasion of Ukraine and all the knock-on impacts onto energy prices and onto poverty and vulnerability, as we were talking about at the start of this program. So we've had a lot of things going on. There are issues across Europe in terms of falling trust in politicians, also falling trust in the media. And the media is there to inform, to some extent to entertain, but to hold power to account. So I think the media is very important, but we can also put questions to and around the power of the media. But in terms of the SNP and the Scottish government, obviously Nicola Sturgeon resigned last year. The handover to Humza Yousaf was not easy. There was a lot going on, and in fact, since this survey happened, there's obviously been more going on because the Butte House agreement fell apart, and now John Swinney is First Minister. So we could spend a whole programme talking about what the SNP looks like at the moment, what the Scottish Government looks like at the moment, how it's going to handle relations with the UK Labour government as we head into the Holyrood elections in 2026. So I think there's a lot to think about and unpack there, rather than just saying people are uninformed or people are badly informed by the media, for instance.
Thank you, Kirsty. Kirsty, I suppose this is your field of expertise when it comes to politics. So most Scots still say that the Scottish government represents them best compared to the Westminster government, but numbers have been falling over recent years. So do you think is it just because mainstream media gives the Scottish government a hard time, or is there something else that's going on?
So I think there's a variety of things going on. I mean, to start off, probably where John Swinney started off, Scottish government has made some mistakes, right? Everybody makes mistakes. Every government makes mistakes. But I was really pleased to hear John Swinney in conversations I've had with him, as well as in talking to the public, holding his hands up and saying, "We've made some mistakes. We need to do things better in future." And actually, as I say, nobody does everything right all of the time. So I like to see politicians and representatives that will apologise for their mistakes and that will say, right, this is how we're going to sort it, or this is how we're going to do it differently next time. Because you kind of get away from the fact that you do make mistakes. It's how you deal with it afterwards. So I think that's kind of the starting point. But levels of trust are falling, right, in everything, right? If you're looking at the cost of living crisis, if you're looking at the fact that despite the fact that you've done things that your politicians told you to, like voted for Brexit, you've done things that the media told you to, supporting anti-European politicians, for example, supporting the reduction of immigration, and your life is still rubbish and you still cannot afford to buy the basic essentials, then of course you begin to lose trust in people. And actually, no matter how much no matter how much we're very clear that the Scottish Parliament and Westminster Parliament are very different, that the governments are very different, you do sort of get tarred with the same brush. So one politician or one government being untrustworthy drags down perceptions about the other ones as well. So I think that you see levels of trust falling. Sometimes it's not at all the Scottish government's fault, but just on the kind of looking at 2019, then looking at thinking about 2020 and COVID, I can't imagine anything more reassuring and trustworthy during that time than Nicola Sturgeon standing up and speaking during those briefings. It was so helpful to listen to a politician who very clearly understands us, understood the way that we wanted things to be explained to us, treated us like adults, and didn't kind of fluff about, sugarcoat it. Was just very clear with us. This is the situation that we're in. This is what's happened. This is what we're doing about it, and this is what we need you to do about it. And I spoke to loads of people on the campaign trail, and there was loads of people that even have gone off the SNP or have gone off politics in general, that were being incredibly positive about those briefings that we had and the fact that Nicola Sturgeon treated them like adults. So I think it would be difficult for us to maintain that high level of support and trust that we had during that period, particularly. And we've had a lot of flux over the past year. Of course, people are going to be less positive about us than they've been, but people believe that the Scottish Government represents them the best. People believe that redistribution of wealth is important, and people believe that growing our economy is important. Now, that says to me that the Scottish Government is very much in line with the thinking of the people of Scotland. And although we do need to make some changes, the big overarching priorities that we have are the right ones that the people of Scotland agree with. And you're right, we're fighting against a media that's going to be down on us no matter what we do. And I was hoping we would get to the point that people would just stop listening because they were being so incredibly negative about even the tiniest little thing, but we don't appear to have reached that yet. Hopefully we'll get there at some point.
Thank you, Kirsty. The survey also talked about which government people think listens to them most, whether Holyrood or Westminster. But just picking up on what Kirsty was saying there, do you think this fall in trust is the result of Boris Johnson followed by Theresa May, folled by Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak, and maybe even Trump's time in office and then his reappearance recently? Is this maybe just impacted on all politics, including Scotland?
I think there is, of course, that the wider context, and the wider context is deeply worrying for a whole series of reasons. There is, I haven't looked at all the results of the survey, but there is a quite a big fall in those people 2019 compared to 2023 who feel the Scottish Government is listening to them. It's gone down from something like 50% to 35%. So that's quite interesting, and it's quite specific. And I can't say, what is fully behind that. I think Kirsty's right that compared to Boris Johnson's shambolic and worse than that way of failing to run government during the pandemic, people found Nicola Sturgeon's press conferences very helpful and professional, although, of course, we're now at the stage of getting the first COVID inquiry report, and there are inevitably and should be criticisms of where the Scottish Government got it wrong. But I think again, if you look at the context of Brexit impact on the economy, the COVID impact, the cost of living impact, and then you can add, as your question suggests, there is a wider context that geopolitically the world looks worrying and unstable, from climate change through to the state of American politics, to relations with Russia and China, or to Europe's divisions over Gaza, where it took South Africa to take a moral stand. But I don't think that means we shouldn't look at the challenges and problems in the way Holyrood is functioning, or what's gone on in the Scottish Government, or what's gone on in the SNP government. I think we actually have to look at all those. And as Kirsty Blackman did say, you have to take responsibility and say, okay, we got this bit wrong, or we got that bit wrong. And the SNP or the Scottish Government, I don't think, can compare to the Tory government in its number of changes of leaders, and it hasn't had anybody like Liz Truss in charge. But obviously in the last 18 months, we've had 3 First Ministers. There's been a lot going on. There's been instability and division within the SNP. But I can't tell you, you'd have to talk to the authors of the survey, what they think, if their survey gives them many pointers on that loss of trust and that not feeling listened to. But obviously, if your democracy is to be functioning healthily, you do want those figures to go up, not down.
Thank you, Kirsty. You're right. 35% of people thought the Scottish Government listens to them more, compared to 12% thought the Westminster Government listens to them. Kirsty, we really are pretty much out of time. We've got a few seconds left if you maybe wanted to say something that you haven't had a chance to say yet.
Just on exactly what we were saying just now, I'm really pleased that John Swinney, when he's talking about the election result that we had in the Westminster election, has said that the first thing is about listening to people, listening to where we've got it wrong and trying to make improvements on that. So, that is what we're focusing on right now. We want to get this right for everybody, and we need them to tell us, actually, how do we improve? How do we get this right, so that we can take the action that folk want us to, in line with the views of the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Kirsty. So that is it for today's show. I'd just like to thank both you, Kirsty Hughes, and you, Kirsty Blackman, for giving up such a large part of your Sunday afternoon. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it for this week's Full Scottish, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Right now, we urgently need to increase our donations if we're going to be able to pay our bills. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,000 a month. So please donate whatever you can afford, even during this cost of living crisis. But anyway, thank you, and once again to our guests, the two Kirstys. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to you at home for watching. Goodbye.